So, like Josh said, my name is Manirah Agans, and I have been going to ECV for around 2 years. And I'm so honored to actually be standing in front of you guys today because this is actually something that I've wanted to do for quite some time, but never really thought I would have an arena in which to do it. And so I wanted to thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And this is going to be fun. I'm excited. I'm going to go ahead and give, just in case you didn't have the opportunity to be with us the last 6 weeks, I'm going to have just a little bit of an explanation about what we've been doing. Here? Excellent. Good to know. Oh, that's so exciting. Yay. All right. All right. So we've been going through a topic series called God on the Move. And during the last 6 weeks, we've talked about how God is moving in our lives, developing character, in our imagination, in multiple ways. And specifically today, oh, thank you. It's going to take a second. We're going to be talking about how God is moving among the poor. And the reason that this whole topic series came up is we have these 4 core values here at ECV, activity of God being one of them. And we had many people mentioning, what does that look like? You talk about the activity of God, the fact that God is someone who actively moves among you, who moves in the church, but what does that really mean? And so that's why we decided to sort of take some time to explain that. And today is the concluding sort of talk on this series. And so thank you so much for being here today. It's going to be a while. All right, excellent. So I'm going to start by just saying, there are many different ways that the phrase "the poor," which was what we're going to sort of be talking about today, is used, such as poor in spirit. But today, I'm going to specifically be talking about the material sense of the poor. People who find that what they have is not sufficient, perhaps. And then we're going to uncover about how God is working among the poor and how it applies universally. So I'm going to start out by saying that I have always loved the poor. Or rather, I've always loved the idea of helping the poor in some way. So you can imagine my delight one day when I was around 7 years old, and my parents told me that we were going to buy some groceries and deliver it to some people who were poor. I was elated. In my young mind, limited in sort of my understanding of what that meant, we were going to have the opportunity to do something deeply meaningful for people in real need. And I finally felt that, as a young person, I was going to be able to be a part of something profound. But this story, which we're going to come back to in just a little bit, did not turn out how I thought it would. Which is good, because today's message is not about, or it's not really like a Hallmark card about how one small sacrifice from one well-meaning person transformed someone's life forever. I mean, yes, that does happen. One small deed is noticed, but today we're going to focus on how God moves. Because God has a heart for the poor, and just as this talk was titled, God is on the move among the poor. And I'd like to shine just a little bit of light on just how much. So, Luke 4 reads, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news spread through him throughout the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, which was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus was at work among the poor. He was in the business of giving the poor good news, hope. And this can be seen throughout all of the Bible. God mentions the poor constantly. The poor are in the forefront of his mind. Yes, he is on the move in the ways that we've been discussing in the last 6 weeks, such as healing people and building character. But God has not forgotten those who society has often looked over. He has not forgotten the poor. And he does more than give poor just a passing shout out. We learn about God's heart through Jesus when Jesus explicitly states, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." And we're all sitting here today, and each of us has our own thoughts and definitions of what that means, what the poor really means, and how we fall into that definition. But today I want us to all start at the same point, this point. That if you're here today and you do consider yourself poor, God has good news. Yes, it would be better if you found out what that good news is, and I'm going to be sort of addressing that in a moment. But also, if you're here today and there are people that you love that consider themselves poor, it's comforting to know that God has good news. And if you're here today and you don't consider yourself poor, it's also great to know that God has good news for people that ever find themselves in a position where their strength is not sufficient. So I'm going to go back to my story from earlier. As we drove to the place where we needed to go to drop off these groceries, I noticed that we were in a neighborhood fairly close to one that I actually knew. And when we stopped, our car had actually pulled up to a house. And all I can say, that as my mom walked to the door to deliver the food, was that I was disappointed. Because, well, it sounds crass, but it's true. I didn't expect them to live in the house, let alone in a neighborhood nearby. And I frankly was unsatisfied with this situation. Their situation appeared to be very similar to mine, and there was nothing profound about my situation. And so I doubted whether or not we were actually doing something deeply meaningful for people in need of real help. But I was missing the point. Because God is not about how poor or how alone or how difficult life is at the moment. He's not looking for a certain level of poor before he can work in profound ways. The point is that God is at work and he's active. And one way he is at work is by providing social justice. In fact, the Bible is full of verses such as the following. He upholds the cause of the oppressed, gives food to the hungry, the Lord sets the prisoners free. But I know the Lord will help those they persecute. He will give justice to the poor. And this is great. This is good news, in fact, that God explicitly states that he is in the business of bringing justice to the poor, the mistreated, the oppressed. He knows each side of a story. He cares about the details. He fully comprehends the social barriers and any disparities. And in a world full of broken systems established by broken people, God has been the one who's been listening. God is the judge, and God is on the move. And I'm happy about this, to be honest with you, because when it comes to social justice, I personally get overwhelmed by the massive amount of change that needs to happen. I recently had an opportunity to go to Brazil, and I don't know if you've been following what's been going on there, but there have been some enormous protests and riots taking place in the major cities. The protests started taking place before I went to Brazil, and I had some friends that expressed concern that I may be in danger if I came across the protest. And I, in fact, did. And yes, I was in danger. Because as we were driving by Josina, the largest slum in South America, people began streaming out of the neighborhood across the road onto which we were driving. And they carried signs and banners, and they swarmed the car, and we actually happened to be the last car through. Now, according to the local people I was with in the car, they said that this was a very small number of people. It was hundreds rather than the thousands that it could sometimes be. And this group of people were determined to be heard. And they are determined to be heard because this is actually still going on. They're tired of the corruption and the excuses and the being ignored, and the fire in their hearts has risen to a point where they are no longer going to wait to be heard. And I am glad. I am glad that they're finally ready to take a stand for what their hearts believe is right. And it made me think, if the people are moving in thousands for social justice and change, how much more does God move for the poor? So in preparation for today's talk, I looked up the definition of social justice, and it says, the fair and proper administration of laws conforming to the natural law that all persons, irrespective of ethnic origin, gender, possessions, race, religion, etc., are to be treated equally and without prejudice. So basically, this means that no matter who you are, no matter your background or your identity, you'll be treated like me, like you, like everyone else. But in preparation for today, I was analyzing this definition, and I felt really like if you infused it with the activity of the poor, activity of God that we've been talking about, if you infused it with his movement, it would be proposing far more than simply being fair and equal. This definition would mean life. It would mean bringing life to people. It would mean helping people to be in a position to move forward and claim real life. Because God is in the business of giving not just social justice, but he's in the business of bringing life. It says in John, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, but I came that you may have life and have it abundantly. And now, my friend, that really is good news. That God sent Jesus to bring us abundant life. Such good news. And that's why social justice is so important to God. That's why the Bible is laden with references to the poor and their well-being, because his desire is for them to have life and have it abundantly. He loves to move in people's lives, to change them, to care for them, to be at work, bringing them abundant life. One place I often get to see God really working at bringing life is at a ministry that ECV partners with called Agape. Agape is a ministry to the homeless, but people come no matter their situation, whether housed or unhoused, working or unemployed, to simply sit, have worship, have Bible study, and eat breakfast together. And it's not really about those who have more leading those who would have less. It's really about discovering more about God together and building relationships together and sharing stories about real life. Now, some of you have heard this story that I'm going to tell before, but 3 years ago, when I came to ECV for the first time, it was hearing about Agape that led me in my decision not to come to ECV ever again. I sat on this left side in the pew as someone talked about Agape and the opportunity to plug in, and immediately my heart began to stir. And I began to think about being part of real community, going to ECV, starting relationships at Agape. No. It scared me to death. Because at that point in my life, I was not doing well. The idea of real community was just too real and too painful. And after I left the service, I didn't come back ever again for an entire year. Because you see, my mom had just died not long before that, and my grieving was still in its messy, crying in the bathroom at work, forcing myself to take showers, not wanting to eat kind of grieving. And I knew that making a sincere connection to people, my heart was going to become open and invested. And the stir I was feeling in my heart was the start of something a little too real, potentially something good, potentially something good. But at that time in my life, if I was opening up to something good, well, I was probably going to be opening up to something pretty ugly as well. And I wasn't ready to be that kind of real with people. I doubted whether or not people would really want me to be that kind of real with them. And so I left. And I came back a year later, not because I was less broken, but because throughout that year, God had been teaching me that it was okay not to live superficially. He wanted me to learn how to live real and how to live abundantly. And without question, the people that I often meet at Agape are the people who really teach me about real life, what it means to truly be real. Because life has put them in a position where there is nothing superficial to hide behind. There's just reality. They're often living from meal to meal, from night to night, wondering what tomorrow will bring. And spending time at Agape has shown me that even those go-to questions that you use to get to know someone and have sort of a regular conversation are really not very real, and in fact, not really even very useful. What do you do? Or where do you study? Or where do you live? Well, I mean, what is the weather going to be like this weekend? These are not going to help me to get to know them and who they really, truly are. In today's society, it can often be your profession, which school you went to, or where you live, that defines your identity. And though none of these things are actually bad, in fact, they can be amazing. These do not fully define people and who they really are. We are so much more than what we do, where we live, and which institution we attend, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, sometimes if we're not careful, these kinds of questions or answers can become a game of superficiality. They can sort of become a surface level way of relating to people, even a surface level way of seeing ourselves. They can pose as a mask that hides our brokenness. And God is not abashed by brokenness. Just as Josh reminded us during our talk last week, we are free to be messy and in process. We are free to be real. So when I came back to ECV a year later and began attending Agape, it was only this time I had the year before to really unpack what was going on and understand the necessity of being real. It was only that being real, that being vulnerable, that made any headway in cultivating relationships that I had with people. And sometimes being real meant having nothing with which to fill sort of the awkward silences, and that was okay too. Because small talk can be just as empty as silence, but it's not as powerful in moving us forward to ask real questions or simply stand together in the reality that there are seasons in life that are hard. And at Agape, often the questions that make the most sense, that bring about the most clarity, the conversations that are worth having in life are the ones in which God is going to be at the forefront, working miracles and transforming lives. Again, when life is hard and messy, and when we are insufficient and broken, often the conversations worth having in life are the ones in which God is going to be at the forefront, working miracles and transforming lives. And that is real. That is the reality that's going to breathe new life into our broken frames. That is good news. That is the activity of God that we've been discussing over the past 6 weeks, that God is providing real life, abundant life, and that God not only wants to provide justice for the poor, he wants to provide materially as well, because he is God on the move. God is moving among the poor to provide abundant life. He is showing up in their real situations, our real situations. He is transforming lives, and he is proclaiming good news. So today I want to put out some questions to you. Let me see. Hold on. Come on. No? All right, well, you'll have to hear them. Thank you. As God is working among the poor, providing abundant life and real transformation, where is God calling you to witness and be a part of his activity among the poor? Secondly, how does God want you to become more real, whether it's unveiling your own brokenness or relating to others? And lastly, in what areas of your life do you really need abundant life? Because God wants to start supplying that as well. So just to close, I want to reiterate that no matter who you are, no matter your social status, no matter how you identify, God has good news. That Jesus came that we can have abundant life, and that God is on the move to make that happen. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Matt is going to go ahead and talk about communion. Yep.
Thanks so much, Manirah. Especially if one of those questions kind of hits you, I'd encourage you to continue processing. I think those are important questions to consider. Because we know that God's at work, God's on the move all over the place. We've been talking all summer about the different ways that God's at work. And we want to be in that place where God is working, because we need God's work in our own lives. We need God's work in our neighborhoods, in our city, and in our world. And if God's especially at work among the poor, if God's especially at work there, then that first question that Manirah asked, I think, is a really significant one. Where would God actually have you take a risk to go and to be among the poor? Because God's particularly at work there, right? And when we do go to those places, right, I think we find that ourselves and our brokenness, right, is unveiled, right? As Manirah talked about, those things that we used to hide behind, they're no good for us anymore. And process, like, where is God calling me to be real about my own brokenness, so that I can see that abundant life come about. So we're gonna enter into a time of response, and as I said, it can be in prayer and considering those questions. That we're gonna spend some time in communion as well, and in worship and in prayer. And the goal in all of this is just to interact with God, who is here in this place, who wants to speak to us, who wants to move and work right here this afternoon. So if the worship team can come forward, we're going to begin with communion. And in communion, we remember and we enter into that story in which Jesus actually came, and when he talks about giving abundant life, we remember that move of Jesus, where he went to the cross and he laid down his life in some sense for us. Right? He gave his body to be broken for us. He poured out his blood. He shed it for us so that we could have abundant life. He said, I will lay down my life and it will be raised up again so that I can raise many with me. So I would just encourage you, why don't we stand as we as we respond? And I would encourage you, if you're a follower of Jesus, or if you would like to become a follower of Jesus, as we enter into communion, I would encourage you, as the worship team leads us into worship, come forward and tear off a piece of the bread, Christ's body broken for you, dip it in the cup, his blood shed for you, as just a way of saying, Jesus, we need your abundant life. If I tend to if I pretend from time to time that I don't need it, Lord, I need it. I need what only you can provide.